Level design has been one of my biggest challenges as a solo dev. I struggled a lot with a lot of things like pacing, sizing, tools, and art. For context, a level in my game is subdivided into several sub-levels, and I am currently working on the first sub-level of the first level. I had been stuck here for a very long time, using a CSG Greybox as I figure out the pacing and size of the sub-levels, also making adjustments according to playtest sessions and other things, but it is now finally time to move on from the Greybox. For the longest time, I always thought that I was going to be using Godot's Gridmap. It seemed like the easiest and most straightforward way to design my levels. However, as hard as I tried to make Gridmap work for me, it didn't align with what I wanted to achieve, and so I decided to just use Blender instead. And since I was already relatively proficient at Blender, it was a much more efficient way to work. Very importantly, my Blender-to-Godot workflow involved saving my blend files directly into the project folder. This way I could design the level while playtesting, which made the process much more efficient. One of my main concerns when it came to tutorial sub-level was size and pacing. I thought that giving the player more time and space to practice and get used to the mechanics would be a good thing, but then I observed that my playtesters would get bored, and so I decided to downsize the level significantly. Furthermore, this was just one sub-level of several others, so each sub-level shouldn't be any longer than about 7 minutes. For comparison, this is the old design, and this is the new one. Now the main concern was the tutorial. I had observed that my playtesters would frequently ignore my instructions, thus getting stuck because of it, which was why I initially made my level very large, as my idea was to introduce the mechanics to the player in smaller, digestible chunks spread out over a large map, though it seems this decision was what made the tutorial level boring. This meant I now had to supercharge my tutorial, making it much more concise, much clearer, and less boring. Previously, I had used interruptive instruction cards that would pause the game and force the player to read. I decided to remove this for now. Whether or not I will bring it back in the future, I will at least have to use less of it. But my current plan is to keep these cards somewhere in the pause menu for the player to visit whenever they feel stuck. I am now using labels that pop up with a sound, and from up top rather than at the bottom as it previously was. I also made the label receive and react to input, so that when the player presses the correct button, it would receive that input and turn green. And finally, I am going to have a hologram let me show the player exactly what to do and where. Now that the tutorial and objectives are harder to ignore, I can make the sub-level much smaller without worrying too much about the player getting stuck. The next challenge was the art. For context, the levels are called clarity stations and are places where robots perform, or used to perform, maintenance tasks to keep a floating city up and running amongst other things. I wanted these stations to look the part. The story had to be told holistically through the textures, the assets, the soundscapes, and so on. But I didn't know where to start. I started with reworking some of the old assets that I had created before the new downsized level design, namely the doors and platforms. The door asset is something I am quite proud of, but also something that I spent more time than I should have on. Nonetheless, it should now be a fully complete asset. I created the texture in Krita, as I usually do, and then modeled and mapped the UVs in Blender. I simply swap between two UV maps to display the locked and unlocked states. The platforms were previously very large and tall and have now been significantly downsized. Aside from the art, I decided to remove moving platforms as my playtesters kept struggling with them, and I do not intend to make the platformer and puzzle aspects of my game difficult, rather a fun and light break from the main gameplay loops, which I intend to be moderately challenging. I also created some new assets that don't necessarily play a part in the gameplay and are more for decoration and storytelling. That's all for now. See you in the next devlog.